The list of those attending runs to almost 24 pages, single-spaced. The Fermi Lab is the only tevatron, the only trillion electron volt instrument in the world, and it's not quite enough to get to the realm where the very first, lowest, simplest sparticle occurs, so that phenomenally we can prove its phenomenality, and begin to understand its existence. And it carries away a very, very small differential energy of more than a tevatron of electron volts, probably 1.5. The great difficulty is given in a few sentences here. The issue concerns the existence of sparticles, i.e. superparticles of known particles. The superpartners of known particles. The latter cannot make up complete supermultiples by themselves. Therefore, each particle in a broken supersymmetric world must have a new superpartner, which we call a sparticle. The sparticle is typically heavier than the corresponding particle by a mass difference, and then they give a mathematical symbol which is like an artistic O. If you had a Sumi ink artist drawing an O or a 0, it would be like that. Times, in parentheses, M subscript N, and is lying yet undiscovered. Furthermore, the application of naturalness arguments to the weak scale of only 100 billion gigavolts, generated in the standard model of physics by an unnatural scalar field sector, has suggested that the trillion electron volts is probably the forthcoming high energy accelerator experiments probing these energies, so that the standard model has been minimally extended mathematically in theoretical vision to what is now called the minimal supersymmetric standard model, the MSSM, so that it is like a palindrome, MSSM, forwards or backwards, the same. It has a mirror symmetry even in just its initials. This quality lends itself to the incredible genius of a mathematician who was a friend of Albert Einstein, somewhat about 10 years older than Einstein. His name was Élie Cartan, and the letters between Élie Cartan and Einstein are published in a very famous volume. I'll bring a copy next week. He wrote in 1913 what became the seed foundation for the theory of spinors. The mathematics of the theory of spinors, when introduced into quantum theory and relativity during the 1920s, spurred a tremendous development, and the complications of that development are such that it took someone who was an active participant in the further development of spin to write its story, and the story of spin is by Shinichiro Tominaga, a great friend of Richard Feynman. And the story of spin was published at the University of Chicago Press. The reason being is that the Fermi Lab is just an hour's drive from the University of Chicago Press. This was published in 1997, and in a series of 12 lectures. And we have to appreciate again that we cannot be told in a single presentation anything significant anymore. And we cannot, even with one series, appreciate the expanded meaning of that significance. And so it involves a very particular recognition on our part that we are dealing with something which initially, in its very simplest elementary form, is called the continuum. We are trying to understand significance in a continuum, and the great volume on the continuum was done by the wonderful mathematician Hermann Weyl, A Critical Examination of the Foundation of Analysis. And for an analytic to function, there must be, before that, an appreciation, which is the earliest registry of the kind of form that an analytic is going to disclose. The analytic discloses aspects of the cosmos. An aesthetic appreciation discloses aspects of the prismatic investigator-creator. And so these presentations that are being delivered here are presenting a new scalar by which to begin to have a visionary expanse complex enough to be able to take the natural cycle in all of its dance within a continuum that continues to complexify. This was already apparent to many of us almost a half a century ago. Here's a poem I wrote in 1968 in San Francisco. Right after my little private tour of the RAD lab, the E.O. Lawrence Radiation Laboratory in Berkeley, where the world's first cyclotron was made. It's called In Spencer's Head. This is the Spencer who wrote The Fairy Queen, who was an early contemporary of Shakespeare, who was the best friend of Sir Philip Sidney, and whose Fairy Queen is dedicated to Queen Elizabeth because it was at that time that the mathematical world occurred for the first time in an objective way. Before then, the large one world was a metaphor. In her time, for the first time, it was possible to have a technological, exact global humanity. And out of that comes the English national anthem, Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves. Britons never, never will be slaves. The entire world, and the first mathematical treatise of that entire world was made by her astrologer, John Dee. John Dee was not only an astrologer, most astrologers who were famous at that time to be able to be astrologers to kings and queens were the best mathematicians of that time. They were the only ones that could figure out the complexities of the development of horoscopes. And Dee, in his preface to a manual on world navigation, how to navigate globally all of the oceans of the world, and worked out the mathematics of it. That was 1575. It was about that time that there was a tremendous realization that we, as a people, as a species, were on the cusp of something new, the discovery of global man. In a technological, applicable way. We were going to be able to be masters of the entire globe for the first time. Not just some empire, no matter how large, but the global sphericality of the empire would include, parenthetically, the entire world and whatever resonances could be had after that. Here's my poem from 1968, In Spencer's Head. Flowing in wavy streamers, shown in dreaming flowers, floral pennants on towers flap. In Spencer's Head, the Red Cross Knight rode, Gloriana valiant, in praise of quest itself, riding, a kind of sea horseman, in the stream of neural fluid, a cloudy phantom of the mind, blown by allegory across the synapse gulf into current reality, freeze-dried. When we look at the kind of language that a poem at the apex of that occurrence, of the new global personality, not the idea of the self, but the appreciation of the magisterial global resonance of the self, that we now were a microcosm of that globalness, and it made us immediately resonant to the harmonic of the world, which is the constellations of the stars. So that now the horoscope was not just a document of your birth and a prediction of your destiny, but it was able to characterize in such a way that there was a mathematic about man's new capacities to control by transform the entire cycle of nature. This is by the great John Donne. Donne was a younger contemporary of Shakespeare. He was the first of a group called the Metaphysical Poets, who transformed English literature after Sidney and Spencer and Shakespeare came the Metaphysicals, who progressively were able to write like John Donne, and finally came to write like John Milton, and all of a sudden the entire coherence of that world not only fell apart, but evaporated and left an ill-adjusted young English man adrift in such a way that he literally was willing to go crazy, if need be, to find, is there some way that I can live in a world however weird? His name was Isaac Newton. Here's a couple of lines from John Donne's Hymn to God, in my sickness. Since I am coming to that holy room, wherewith thy choir of saints forevermore, I shall be made thy music as I come. I tune the instrument here at the door, and what I must do then think here before. Whilst my physicians by their love are grown cosmographers, and I their map, who lie flat on this bed, that by them may be shown that this is my southwest discovery. Perfectum febris, that's by fever I will probably die. These straits to die. In a horoscope, the west is the death, and the south is the source of the melody. I joy that in these straits I see my west, for though their currents yield return to none, what shall my west hurt me? As west and east in all flat maps, and I am one, are one, so death doth touch the resurrection. That once you have a globality to your personality, there are no ends. A voyage around the world is a continuous voyage of the continuum. So that the discovery, when one comes again, you are somewhat different. Though you may want to take the same great circle around the globe, it will be somewhat different. And this is very familiar. Here is about frames. Over the decades, scores of paradoxes have been introduced to illustrate the seemingly bizarre nature of special relativity. They usually involve two frames of reference traveling at different speeds that are making observations of the same object. The paradoxes arise because the observers in each frame see the same object in two entirely different ways. Almost all of them can be resolved using two observations. First, length contraction in one frame has to be balanced by time dilation in the other. If we forget to balance the distortion of space with the distortion of time, then the paradoxes arise. Second, paradoxes arise if we forget to bring the two frames together at the end. The final resolution of who is really younger or shorter can be achieved when we bring two observers together in space and time and compare them. Unless we bring them together, then it is possible to have two objects, each shorter and younger than the other, which is impossible in Newtonian physics. It was bad enough in Newtonian physics, but the crack before the earthquake of Newtonian physics, before the world collision of relativity and quantum theory, the initial crack was from Johannes Kepler. Exactly at the time that John Donne wrote that poem, exactly at the time that Shakespeare was writing King Lear, And it was with the publication in 1609 of the New Astronomy. The New Astronomy we talked about last week was Kepler was the first to mathematically be able to understand the moving stars, the sun and the moon, the planets, do not describe circles. Their orbitals are ellipses. And that there is a property about these ellipses that there are certain extensions in their elliptical movement that they speed up in their orbits, and when their orbits come closer to the center of their ellipticality, they slow down. So that planets do not just move mechanically, they move according to a ratioability of time and space. Already in 1609. But what's interesting is that Kepler had very few people that he could correspond with, because these writings were severe against the Roman Catholic Church power. If you thought Copernicus made a challenge, or if you thought that Galileo the next year in 1610 with a telescope would make a challenge, Kepler was the one who put the first crack that would not go away. It was a hairline fracture first, and the first people to understand it and get it were people in northern Italy who were in contact especially with England. Because the English ambassador to Venice, appointed in 1606, was a man named Sir Henry Wotton, who had one of the largest libraries in Renaissance England, who was a good friend of Shakespeare and the company, and of Spenser, had been also of the group around Sir Philip Sidney and so forth. And that those Italians of the 1605, 1609 era were in contact with the English, because the English originally, with Spenser and Sidney taking the lead intellectually in England, they were in contact with Giordano Bruno, who was the first one to be able to theorize, to envision that there was an infinite cosmos, which meant that the only way that a prismatic jewel of a person could get in tune with it, not in touch with it, it wasn't phenomenal, it was a numen. It had to be tuned with, not touched. You cannot touch the infinite, yet human beings may tune to the infinite. But it requires for them to have more and more facets of themselves so that they become not just interesting or not just crystals, but they become jewels. And that in a jewel matrix, one can now tune to the cosmos in its actual scalar. So that one of the earliest high Dharma phrases is that the cosmos is a jewel matrix. And that jewel matrix is such that all the stars are jewels in a matrix, and that we join that matrix when we tune ourselves to our jewel-like spirit person, which then turns inside out the whole notion of what an astrology is. The sun moves in the plane of the ecliptic through the stars, and it touches 12 constellations. Actually, the jewel matrix is 88 constellations and growing. That's only on this planet. But those 12, that plane of the ecliptic, is not the motion of the sun against the stars as astrology thought, but the new mathematics, as of Kepler, understood it is the movement of the earth against the stars. And that plane of the ecliptic is not a circle. It's elliptical in a very special way. It is an energy wave. So that the energy of the earth in its orbit in a year makes an energy wave, which is the plane of the ecliptic, which then is the calibration of this planet vis-a-vis the stars, vis-a-vis the nearest of the wedge of the cosmos that we are able to behold. So that now we have a mathematical number. We know the energy of the earth in the cosmos. But it's very difficult unless you know the harmonic. And Kepler's last book was The Harmonics of the World. Stephen Hawking, in his book On the Shoulders of Giants. Why can we see so far? Because we stand on the shoulders of giants. Newton. Harmonies of the World, Book 5, Johannes Kepler. Now, they tried to get to Kepler by all sorts of ways. He was impeccable as a person. He was impeccable in his marriage. So they picked on his mother and tried to charge her with witchcraft. How can this guy do this stuff? He was charmed by the mother, who was a witch. And of course, that failed. But what happened was that, and it's documented here, a documentary history of the problem of fall from Kepler to Newton. Because an orbit is that the Earth falls gravitationally to the sun, to the not quite the sun. The focus is not in the sun. It's just off the surface of the sun, what we would today call a barycenter. It falls into it, but it falls into it in such a way that it is moving so fast that it keeps its orbit. And not only that, but the sun also falls towards the center of a whole cluster of other stars, and it's moving, and that cluster is moving in a great arm of a galactic, the Milky Way structure, and our whole galaxy is moving with thousands of others towards an unimaginably very large attraction. And that whole millions of clusters of galaxies are also moving towards some kind of a destination. But what is catastrophic about it is that all of this, by the time of Newton, resulted in not just the fracture of Kepler, but resulted in the breaking of the circle. Marjorie Hope Nicholson, who's one of the great scientific, aesthetic, literary critics. Her first little book, Science and Imagination, and she did many others. The Breaking of the Circle, Studies of the Effect of the New Science upon 17th Century Poetry. So that one can read the first tremulous genius intuition that a fracture is occurring is the publication of Shakespeare's Hamlet in 1604. Because he was getting not only the information about Kepler, but getting the information from one of the great English mathematicians, Sir Thomas Harriot, who was one of the mathematical correspondents with Kepler. We'll talk next week about Thomas Harriot and the discovery of the New World, where we are. Very important man. She says, the sequel to Breaking of the Circle is Newton Demands the Muse, Newton's Optics and the 18th century poets. The 17th century poets had a really difficult time. The 18th century poets refused to consider that they were demolished just because the old cosmology was now fractured beyond repair. It only meant then that we cannot live by a fractured world, so we will have a new revolution. We will have a new orbital for man, and we will take as our scalar the true mathematics of the energy of the Earth in its orbital energy multiplied by the years, multiplied by all of the years in large time-form rhythms, so that we may have a new scalar for man, a new kind of mankind. In Science and Imagination, Marjorie Hope Nicholson, absolutely so brilliant. The new astronomy of Kepler had a dual origin in England. Imported from Italy, it also had a native English background, since England had produced important works of the nova of 1572. The nova was, there was a new star. It was a supernova. And the 1572 supernova was the whole raison d'etre for Kepler's magister friend, Tycho Brahe, to set up his observatory on the special island of Uraniborg to study what is really going on. If there are new stars, is God creating new things now? Are we in the midst of a new kind of creation? And just as Kepler was working on the final copy of the New Astronomy, another supernova in 1604, exactly when Hamlet was produced. So Shakespeare and his company tore down the theater that they had in London, packed up all the timbers and took it across the Thames and set up there a new theater and called it the Globe. And over the open stage of the Globe was a canopy hidden from the audience, which all the actors could see as they gestured, and there was the plane of the ecliptic, the 12 constellations of the zodiac, that what was happening on the stage was the energy of the world was being renewed in a new way. All the world is a stage, and the correlation is our stage is transforming it in the way in which we now understand transforms. When we come back from the break, we'll take a look at the way in which mathematical theories are not products of the brain. They are creations of consciousness in an expanded scalar called the spiritual mind. Let's take a little break. Let's come back. We're looking at 400 years ago when there was a new astronomy, really for the first time. It was not like Copernicus, which was a polite challenge. This was a fracture. We're facing a new mind. The new mind came to a pinnacle in a fearful decade of the 1950s. One of the great commentators of that decade was I.F. Stone, and his collected essays is called The Haunted 50s. If you look at science fiction films of the 50s, they're all about the monsters that are coming. The first 4-star science fiction film is The Thing, 1950. By the early 1960s, it was apparent to those of us who had matured in the 1950s that only other dimensions of ourself were going to be available for the expansion. And one of the earliest encouragements to us was the kind of poetry that found its greatest traction in the 1920s. One of the great poets of that time was Rilke. But the star poet of that era, of the 20s, moving into the 30s, and then making an impress on the 50s and early 60s was Yeats. Here's a poem of mine from the early 60s, musing long over Yeats. Musing long over Yeats, I seem in such a vague disquiet to be another than myself this night, some other, a wandering spirit, an other's age, some rare source drives me by these silent hours, sat and contemplating the clock, familiar mystery, sitting to write in language I now hardly know. Yet by Yeats's midnight will surely write, recognizing second sight. It became apparent that if one tried to use the mind in its symbolic structure that had all of its correlates and reference, it would no longer work. It was not a question of preempting that swirl with drugs, amphetamines, LSD, etc. That preempting was a source of aggravation for many of us. I can't tell you how many scores of times I was called upon to bring somebody down, to talk for 20 hours straight with someone so that they could get through their bad trip, and got a reputation in San Francisco of being somebody who could do that. If it took 50 hours to follow the swirled convolutions of the trip and always weave that flow back into a kind of it's the kind of thing that you used to get in old 19th century books when they swirled colors together, and they call it French marbled paper. It does no good because that swirl still occurs only as a blur within that symbolic structure. And when it goes away, you need another trip. What happens, though, is that it makes stale the symbolic structure, and it raises the energy level so that the next time you have to have more. You have to do more. Whereas the really comprehensive transform is to constellate the jeweled person. Then, two things happen at the same time. One discovers that consciousness is a field, not a phenomenon. And that as a field, it has a particular affinity to the field of nature, that all of a sudden nature is really a field. And that while nature is source, it is not a number. It's the source of number. And one of the most peculiar developments of all of that, Hermann Weyl came up with the algebraic theory of numbers. These are the Princeton monographs in mathematics. This is the first one. And this is the way that, this is 1940. And this is the way that mathematics, right at the beginning of 1940, was trying to, in publishing, catch up to monographs that were weaving back together what had happened in the 30s and the 20s. And one of the things that had happened was that there were a number of geniuses who had occurred. And one of the great geniuses in the algebra of numbers, obviously a crisis statement, this little monograph on the David Hilbert, the theory of algebraic number fields. Not only they're numbers, but there are number fields, and they're algebraic numbers and algebraic number fields. And Hilbert is famous for all time for developing Hilbert space. This is a beautiful monograph on an introduction to Hilbert space. If you're a mathematician, Paul Halmos, a very great mathematician, his development, second edition, Introduction to Hilbert Space, in the theory of spectral multiplicity. Not only are there spectrums of differential play, like the proverbial rainbow through a prism, that when the person becomes a prism, the spectra play through you, but you can only see them if you're in the field of consciousness in a very special way. The Greek word for that way is theoria, out of which we get theory. The Greek word is Pythagorean. It means contemplation, not contemplation of something yet, but the contemplative life, which is to behold the field of theoria, which comes as a great shock and a great surprise, because when it first is beheld, it does not register at all. Because our whole experience with fields is through the cycle of nature. And nature as a field is a zero field. And so our mother is the first that we recognize, and it's the zero field of nature. One of the great meditators, and meditation is different from contemplation. Contemplation is a beholding. Meditation is a concentration. And the greatest early meditator of concentration was the historical Buddha. Dhyana is the theoria of the concentration of the symbolic structure of the mind so that it is able to be concentrated to become, in Sanskrit, ekagrata, single-pointedness. And single-pointedness of mind in a high-powered yoga is what we today call a singularity. And that singularity does what all singularities do. It is reabsorbed into the zero field of nature and reappears spontaneously. And it's not that it just now did this for the first time, it's that this is the syncopation of the rhythm of the real. That it always does this, that the oneness of it always is absorbed into the zero field and always reemerges as one again. And it's that syncopated rhythm which is the signature of the energy. So that whatever occurs punctuated with zeros all through its ones. Which is why a binary, like a 0 and 1, can make, if you run it fast enough, it can make the imagery of the world, like a computer. You can't do it so much with frames, but you can do it with binary sets. The difference that the Buddha discovered, though, unlike previous yogis who had done this kind of concentration but never to the consummate actuality, the Buddha, the historical Buddha, took it further to apply his techne, his art of this single-pointedness, not only to see the energy rhythm, but that the oneness that always occurs has 16 parts. And the 16 parts are not parts of things. They're parts of a moment of thought. That thought has its own particle, and that particle has 16 parts, only 8 of which are discursive and can be seen individually as sub-parts, as 8 parts of the part, which is the moment of thought. The other 8 are the zeros in between those ones, and so they never occur as something. They always occur the way I was taught to say it 40 years ago. They occur as a trill. It's a musical term. In the 70s, when I began teaching as a professor in Canada, I changed the language, so I began to use a cinematic term called a cascade. The zero intervals in between the 8 parts of a moment of thought occur as a cascade of zeroness that has a symmetry to those other 8, so that the 8 constellate as a unity, as an ensemble. And because they do, the moment of thought is able to occur in time and generate space. Otherwise, it could not do so. The dynamis, the momentum, is because time accumulates. That constellation, while it happens very fast, does not happen all at once. It happens in its cycle, its sequence. But as Melville will say in Moby Dick, look here. Don't just be a novice sailor. Be an experienced sailor on the high seas of really high Dharma. Because when the field of consciousness comes into play, it acts as a quintessential fifth dimension. so that the zero field of nature now has a supersymmetry with the field of consciousness. But when a moment of thought is now, on the other hand, absorbed in the field of consciousness, its punctuation is not by zeros, but by infinities. So that it comes as a shock that everything is transparent and kaleidoscopic at the same time. Because one now sees the invisible through a second kind of sight. That second sight reveals both the vacuousness of the real world and the infinitude of the prismatic, jewel-like cosmos, all at the same time. Here's a poem of mine. Again, this is a volume I'm going to put out called San Francisco 60s Poetic, Poems 1958 to 1970. This one's called Musing on Li Po with Relativity. Li Po is the greatest Chinese poet, lived in the Tang Dynasty. He was part Eurasian. He was a Chinese with blue eyes. I remember one time coming out of a little hole in the wall in one of the alleys, sub-alleys of an alley in San Francisco, the Kwangming Dao Society. I went in and there was nothing but aquariums and plants growing everywhere, and there was no one there. And I came out, and as I came out and walking down the alley, in a big old trench coat, this Chinese looked up, he had blue eyes. And for a second, I couldn't quite glimpse it because I remembered that my Tao master said that you always can tell a Taoist master because his pupils are square. They're not circular like other. In other words, he frames what he sees instantly. Yeah, he's not in the cycle. I couldn't tell, but I knew his eyes were blue. It's amazing. Here's the poem, Musing on Li Po with Relativity. He was madly the greatest poet who ever lived, and madly still is. Chu Fu dreamed of him and thought of him even at the world's end. If with a little more wine in time and pure space in place of place, I could just now greet old Taoist Li Tai, poem for poem, contemplated rather, glared straight through the moon's reflection, plasma wet, sent the thousand autumn name downstream fast to the equation. If one old MC equals MC squared can do all that, we are never, oddly, going to get sober. Yeah. One of Hilbert's two books in print everywhere, The Foundations of Geometry, and a beautiful volume which has become a world classic, Geometry and the Imagination. They're printed by Chelsea Publishing in New York, and they've been available forever. This was first published in '52. It's still in print. You can find it. Geometry and the Imagination, David Hilbert. And in it, you begin to get the geometry that begins to come out when you get facets of something. And next week, we're going to talk about the shape is not just a globe or a sphere. If you have a plane geometry, you get the kind of geometry that you get with Euclid. If you have spheres, then you get trigonometric functions, but there are different kinds of globes, of spheres, that bring conscious dimensions into play in such a way. We're going to talk next week about one of the kinds of surfaces that occurs in some of those exotic worlds are Riemann surfaces. And Riemann surfaces in Hilbert spaces do things that are triple magic, and were triple magic to those in the late 20s and early 30s who began to understand that we're working with something here that we were told about it, but we thought that they were only mystics and poets. And we were mature so that we're not reading poets and we're not listening to mystics. We're mathematicians, we're scientists. And now we're turning out that we're the mystics. And one of the first who realized that was Wolfgang Pauli. Wolfgang Pauli was if you know old films, a Peter Lorre type character. Very nice, very quiet, devastating. And he got the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1945, and this is his lecture, Exclusion Principle and Quantum Mechanics. We'll talk more about Wolfgang Pauli next week. He did a book with Carl Jung on synchronicity, on archetypal forms of synchronicity. And one of the things that came out of that for Jung is that he got blasted by Pauli's quiet, Swiss, elegant, but penetrating thing, because Pauli ended up as one of the boys of Niels Bohr in Copenhagen. And he writes, "A new phase of my scientific life began when I met Niels Bohr personally for the first time, Papa Bohr. This was in 1922 when he gave a series of guest lectures at Göttingen. Göttingen is Hilbert's university, and because he was there, he attracted every great mathematician in the world. So Göttingen became the Harvard of mathematics in his time, absolutely. That's where Oppenheimer studied, etc. In which he reported on his theoretical investigations on the periodic system of elements. And we brought that in the theory of atomic spectra of hydrogen, the first of the elements, which means that all of the elements then will have a spectrographic registry, and that the taproot of all of that was the genius of a young American who invented astrophysics, George Ellery Hale. And because Hale was an instrument builder, he built the first heliospectrograph out of parts that he designed and put them to the telescope in his backyard in Chicago. And his backyard in Chicago, on the other side of the fence, was the University of Chicago, and eventually became the first professor of astrophysics in the world because he made the science. And the Astrophysical Journal, I'll bring in the big volume, the 100th anniversary issue of it. All of a sudden, one could take light and not just make a rainbow like Newton had made with his prism in the dark room, and then all of the talk about the theory of colors and energies and rays and all of that. One of the great figures who did that was Goethe, his theory of colors. It isn't just that those little rays will give you a color. They give you an infinite, significant amount of meaning if you can get to it, which means you have to have a prismatic mind. But the prismatic mind doesn't fit inside the brain. It has to have a different space in which to occur. So that when you see the blessed, they have a sphere of space around their head. An open space. They now do not just think with their brain as an instrument, but they use the field of consciousness to play through the prismatic person who they are. Now, instead of it being some kind of basic mechanic thing, numbers now belong to a mathematic, which is an art. And that higher mathematics is like a very high poetic language. And that to be able to speak it is almost impossible, but you can read it on the page if you're used to it. And what I have done is to make a correlation so that you can learn to speak it and correct yourself intuitively while you're speaking, and truth-telling. Here's another little poem, and by now you're understanding that a poetic is the proof that you're able to function in the field of consciousness as an artistic person. Spring with Li Po. Li Po. The rain has stopped and the last clouds are scattering down the canyons. Fresh wind blowing our hair. In the clearing twilight mild, let us drink more slowly. The moon will rise in no time at all. It's a Zen poem. Time, which was before in the natural cycle, had a present moment. But as soon as one is able to go into a high-powered quintessential field of consciousness, the infinity of it transforms the zero-ness of nature so that the zeros do do-si-dos with the infinities. Now each ray, each particle of each ray, of each moment of thought is creatively playful as well as able to remember. It registers in an increasing accumulation. It becomes much more powerful than anyone could have supposed, but it also becomes much more playful. It becomes acrobatic. And the great acrobatic mathematician of the early 30s was Paul Dirac. Here's a little book. His books usually were very thin. This is about 80-some pages. Spinors in Hilbert space. If you get not only something that is moving in a new kind of a sphere, so that there are now modifications of those trigonometric relationalities, which are forces that come together and have a resultant called a vector. Those are standardly vectors that are very simple of abstract spheres that seem stationary. What happens is that in the interesting cosmos, those spheres spin. They rotate. And not only that, they rotate on an axis. In the Divine Comedy, Dante says the gravitational pull of hell is so great that the further you go into it, the less you can get out. And at the center is the devil. But Dante has a good guide in Virgil, who knew that the way out of that kind of thing is to follow along the axis where there's no pull at all, there's no gravity at all on the axis. So you can get out, you can go up through to the mountain of purgatory, and you can get out of hell. You can get out of the inferno by going up the ascent. What happens with Paul Dirac is that the axis works both ways, either way. So that the rotation axis now has a matrix notation. And one of the interesting things, just to cut to the chase, to give you two new words. They're new here. When they were first uttered, they were absolutely new. Dirac was born in 1902. This was republished in 1974. It originally was a series of lectures in 1969. Page 28, section 14, quetes and bras. Not bras like brassieres, but quetes and bras. The algebraic qualities that we are working with may be considered as linear operators operating to the right on a kind of vector. We call these vectors quetes and write them, and then the inscription is a vertical little line, then an X, and then a wedge going out. Those are quetes, following the notation of quantum mechanics. The dual vectors are called bras, written with a wedge going the other way with a Y and then the line. A bra and a quete have a scalar product written wedge out, Y, line, X, wedge the other way, which is a number. The algebraic quantities may be considered as linear operators operating to the left on bras. So quetes to the right, bras to the left, so that there is a chirality, symmetry in a rotating sphere, sphericality, which will have an axial balance. We talked last week about how there are ways to make symmetries mathematically out of 2s, 3s, 4s, 6s, but you cannot do it traditionally with 5s. And the all-time great example of that is a starfish. A starfish has a rotational symmetry to it. And that rotational symmetry of a starfish is very much like an archetypal insight into the rotation in a field of consciousness. It's not only that an alchemical process will have a quintessential magical transform of the elements or of any phenomena, including time itself, including space itself, but that ability to transform it, that quintessentialness of it, means that all of the essentiality of it is able to be transformed not only from the bottom through the axis, but through the top down through the axis. There's a double transform that happens with consciousness as a field that comes into play. One transform is that nature now, instead of just energetically in its energy frequency create phenomena, they create magical phenomena that can not only transform, they can transform transformations. But on the other axis, the same thing happens in the mind. And it happens in the structure of symbolic thought. And it happens in the very center of the structure of symbolic thought, which in nature is the imagination. All images come to the realm of the imagination. In nature, in that natural cycle. And the plane of the ecliptic will be the image base by which you're taught to live. Your mythology. Your symbolic integration of that, and so forth. If you have the quintessential field, infinite field, a differential field, not an integral field of consciousness, come into play in the mind, it does an exchange. It says to the symbolic structure of the mind, have my infinite function of remembering. And being in you, it will become the memory. And I will accept from you your imagination, the imagination, and in my infinite field, it will become creative imagining. This is how consciousness is the field out of which art forms emerge, including the art of the spiritual person. Everyone who works out of the creative imagining and remembering of the conscious field becomes an artist and is capable then of generating a process which we call history, but which is really kaleidoscopic consciousness working through the prismatic creative person. And if you call the infinite field theory, and you call the prismatic person the investigator, then what is happening, that process will be not only experience, but it will have experiment as a quality that's there, and out of that will come science. That's why the arts and sciences are related. And when they're related in that way, the cosmos registers, not only is there a new player in the game, but it's more interesting, the more the merrier. And actually, instead of being a depressive place that the devil would like to convince you is just junky, crappy, is the best party imaginable. More next week.